And I'm going to go ahead and get started because I understand Regan's out there with a whip, so everyone should be here. I would love to just start by praying, and then I'll get a little bit more into kind of who I am, why I'm here, and into kind of what I have for you guys today. So, Jesus, we invite you here, Lord. We know you're here. We just say you are King. I ask that you would come, that you would open our ears to what you have for us today, that you would get me out of the way, and that you would just soften us to what you're inviting us into. We pray all this in your name. Amen. I am so glad you guys are here. I'm encouraged by this. I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a church that wants to talk about mental health, because the history of the church and mental health is one that is not great. It's not one I'm super excited about. I think overall, right now, side note, I'm getting my PhD, which is code for I'm tired all of the time. I also have 2 children, 7 and 9, and you'll see a picture of them here in a second. But right now I'm writing my dissertation, and a lot of it has to do with the intersection of faith and mental health and sexual health. And so I'm kind of like living in the world of academia and all of this research and theological history. And I really find that it boils down to a lack of the word "and." We got to this point in our history where it was either you can lean into these spiritual disciplines and pray more and fast and worship and go to church, or you can go to a hospital or get therapy. And it kind of became this or you can do this or that, but there wasn't much tension for the fact that they both can coexist. And so I'm excited today that is kind of changing in our world. I'm encouraged by that as a therapist, and I'm glad you're here. So again, for those who might have missed it out there, my name is Ashley. I'm a therapist in private practice just up the street. I office out of a small church called Northwest Vineyard. It's part of the Mile High Vineyard movement. And I have 2 kiddos. This is on the next slide. You will see my middle school sweetheart, who I married 14 years ago. Oh, it's me. Okay, thank you. So, and those are my 2 kids. And this is why I think mental health is so important, because it is the foundational aspect to living a fulfilling life, and it affects every part of our existence. It affects our emotional, social, spiritual, physical selves. It impacts our community. Our emotional and mental health has ripple effects. And I don't know if you guys have seen kind of all the advertisement. I know they're about to start Emotionally Healthy Spirituality here, which is a phenomenal book. I love the book. And in that, he argues that our spiritual maturity will never outpace our emotional maturity, that these things are so closely intertwined. And I would like to just start today by sharing some of my story and how I landed in the world of mental health and what that might have to do with faith in general, and my faith particularly. So when I was young, I met Jesus when I was 7. I grew up in a Christian home. I love Jesus. He's my best friend. And I also had a mom who was really open about mental health, who talked a lot about mental wellness. She suffered from depression. She also sought treatment. She also loved Jesus. So I was fortunate to grow up in a home where all of these things coexisted and were talked about frequently. And when she began to kind of see the signs of depression in me, starting in middle school, she went ahead and got me the support in therapy practice. So I started going to therapy, and I'll never forget bringing to my small group leader, I was in high school, kind of this decision I wanted to make about going on medication. And I was advised to not go on medication, to pray, to continue coming to small group, to continue leaning into the Word of God. And so I had some different, advisors within my home. My mom advocated that I start medication. I'm glad I did. Ultimately, that small group leader meant no harm. She's still part of my life. She's awesome and loves Jesus. And I left kind of that season. I remember kind of realizing, mental health might need to be masked in some ways so that I can be socially accepted in this faith community, right? I might need to mask some things so that I can qualify for leadership, so that I can disciple others and be perceived as spiritually mature. So, went to college, and by then was off medication, suffered greatly. I was high performing, 4.0, did all the things, volunteered a lot, went to an amazing church, was able to lead in some capacity in that environment, and really did have a hard time. My depression was untreated. It manifested in eating disorder and relationship issues. Moved forward, got married to the love of my life, and had this beautiful baby who I planned to have, right? This was I was excited to bring this baby into the world. And I did all the normal things. I registered and I built the nursery, and I'll never forget the day she was born, not because it was necessarily the most joyful. Everyone says, that's the happiest day of my life. It wasn't, because it was maybe not, but I just felt such a detachment. I didn't feel like I was in my body. And even the people now that come and reflect on, when they visited me in the hospital, met my daughter Summer, you just weren't home. It was it was a shell, and you were just existing in it. And at this point in my life, I was a practicing therapist. I'd been swimming in the world of mental health for a while. I was happily married. I had a job and was well performing in it. Everything seemed fine. I was involved in my community that I still love, and involved in my church. And this experience of suffering internally and not having a name for it, and also simultaneously kind of trying to mask it while I was in my church community, it turned out I was even lying to myself in some regard. You're fine. It's fine. We'll get over this. It's the baby blues, right? It's just hormones. But when she was about 5 or 6 months old, things got so bad. I was so miserable and felt so trapped, and so much shame for feeling that when I had such a beautiful, healthy baby. And I ended up plotting the end of my life and planning how I was going to take my own life. I had it all mapped out. I was going to reach out to a neighbor, have her come over, take care of the baby. And my husband was at work, and rocked the baby, put her down, said my goodbyes, went into my closet to complete what I had planned. And I heard my door shut downstairs to my house. And I wasn't planning on anyone being there. My husband was at work. I hadn't texted the neighbor yet. And so I thought, well, that's weird. And I went downstairs, and it was one of my friends from church, from college, who had recently moved to Denver. And he walked in, and he was like, I just felt like God was telling me to come check on you. Is everything okay? And everything was not okay, right? And I just broke down, and I started crying. And he stood there with me and got my husband home. They got me to the doctor. I got on medication. And that was a turning point for me. And in that moment, this guy, this friend of mine, he's like an uncle to my kids. He's my brother. He's incredible. He still lives here, very involved in our lives. He didn't pray over me or, call me into a fast, or he stood there with me and turned on HGTV. And we sat there, and he held space for me. And that was a powerful moment, because he was part of my spiritual community in college. He was a huge part of he had been in spaces where I had masked and tried to play the game and do the thing so that I could appear spiritually healthy, with kind of this impression that if I don't, I could be perceived as unhealthy. And I wouldn't want that, because I really did love Jesus and I love to follow him. And so out of a fear of being misunderstood, I didn't share for a long time. And that shame and that fear dissipated the moment that this guy stood there with me. My brother just hugged me, called my husband, and got me the help I needed. And that's why I'm here today, because I think that mental health has been far and wide misunderstood. This is a picture of me on the day that I went into that closet to follow through with that plan. I don't think I look depressed. I don't look unhappy. I look okay-ish. I mean, I'm not wearing makeup and I'm sleep deprived because I'm a mom. But ultimately, you wouldn't know. I posted this on social. Nobody knew. Everyone thought I was fine, because that's what I wanted people to think. The truth is that mental health struggles can look like this. And most of the time they do. 1 in 5 adults, so 1 in 5 people in this room struggle with a mental health illness. 17% of youth experience a mental health disorder. 1 person dies of suicide every 40 seconds. There are more deaths by suicide, according to the UN, than by war and homicide combined. It continues to be a leading cause of maternal death in the United States and in the UK. In 2023, the UK reported a staggering 39% of maternal deaths within that first year postpartum were due to suicide. 37% of those mamas had a pre-existing condition. And so, my conviction as someone who loves Jesus and who believes that the church can change the world is, why would we not be the loudest advocates for mental health care, right? I love when Jesus quotes Isaiah 61 in Luke 4. This says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted and proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness from the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's salvation and favor, and the day of vengeance for our God, to comfort those who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of spirit of despair." As the people who are called to be like Jesus is and to be his hands and feet, we are called into that fullness of life that he promises us. And so often we settle for less. These are some of my favorite scriptures that in my world really call me to the importance of this integration of our mental wellness and our spiritual health. We serve an emotional God. I don't know if you've read the book lately. I mean, he's out there flipping tables. He's calling people brood of vipers. He is crying. He's an emotional God. And I think he made a pretty clear statement by sending his son incarnate with a brain and with emotions. And sure, our mental wellness, our emotions can be an element of our existence that leads us into dark places, into places that are far from God. But they also are a powerful vehicle for how God engages us and how we get to engage the living God. And he calls our whole selves, every part of you, every part of our existence, every dark corner of our mental aspects, into his presence to renew us and restore us. And without embracing that fullness of health, we really aren't living the fullness of life that he promises us. I'm going to tell a quick story. I was walking my kids home from school, and like when you ask your kids, "How was your day at school?" "Good, fine." You get those one-word answers. So I've learned, "What did you have for lunch?" is a good question, because it's not like a one-word response usually. And we were walking home from school. I asked my daughter, "What'd you have for lunch today?" Because the school now gives everyone free lunch, by the way, which I'm a huge fan of. It's really served me this year. So we're walking home. "What'd you have for lunch?" And she said, "A salad." And I said, "Oh, was it good?" And she said, "Yes, there were no ladybugs in it today." Okay, so I let that sit for a second and then said, "Honey, are there normally ladybugs in your salad?" She said, "A few times." And I said, "Oh, okay. That's not normal. No, we don't normally eat bugs. Like in the US, we don't eat salads with ladybugs in them." But that was her bar. What a low bar. Her bar for a good lunch that day was that there were no ladybugs in it. And then she later told me her chicken nuggets didn't have bones in them that day. My goodness. And it really called me to this place of like, wow, we can live with low bars, right? Fullness of life can look so much bigger and so much more beautiful than what we have come to know it as. And so I'm going to dismantle some myths about mental health. I'm going to get into some definitions and some, diagnoses, if you will. I don't want this to be a psychology class, because I know that's not what you signed up for, but you also came here. So I'm assuming you have some interest. So I'm going to give you a little dose. But these are some myths that drive me bananas as a therapist. One is that traditional spiritual disciplines are sufficient to cure mental illness. And what I mean by that is kind of what I started with, right? Like, go pray, go fast, go to church. I'm just going to pray more. These things aren't bad, right? These are good things. And right now in 2025, researchers can take a strand of my hair, look at it, and notice that I have depression. These mental illnesses are biological. They can be. They aren't just in your head, which is another point up here. So if you're going to tell someone with diabetes they need to pray more or fast, sure. Also, and they could maybe take some medicine, like there are a variety of interventions available that can also be paired with some spiritual disciplines that would bring great freedom. Mental illness is a sign of weakness. The strongest people I know are the people that I sit across from every single day who are suffering and who are choosing hope and who are choosing to lean into Jesus and take their medications, engage in some meditation with the Lord, and practice their EMDR, whatever we're doing together to get healed. It's a sign of shallow faith. Again, if someone comes to me and tells me they have breast cancer, I'm not going to tell them they have shallow faith. I'm sorry. I think with some, there are some theological convictions out there that go, and I'm not a theologian, and I'm not going to pretend to be, but mental suffering is not a sign of shallow faith. And in my opinion, it shouldn't disqualify someone from leadership or from participating in the body. And I attend a Vineyard Church. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of like a movement. And one of their phrases is everybody gets to play. And I love that. That's actually why I started going. I'm like, yeah, everyone gets to play. The people who have depression and bipolar and trauma and anxiety, they all get to play. Mental illness isn't in your head, and poor mental health is noticeable. I hope I squelched that one with the images I shared at the beginning, but it is not always noticeable. In fact, as humans, what's really fascinating, our nervous system, we were created to survive. God wired us brilliantly to survive. And genetically, actually, our ancestors, which this can get weird with some religious practices, but our ancestors actually, their lived experience shaped their DNA, which informs our DNA. They call it epigenetics. Google it. It's a thing. And the reason that's so powerful to know is because as humans, we will mask mental health. We will mask certain conditions in an effort to belong socially, because primally, social exclusion registers as death. If you think thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, when we lived as tribes, as community, we relied on one another greatly for survival. And so our DNA actually triggers a trauma response. We'll get into trauma in a second, when we are coding or perceiving social exclusion. And this is why we will go above and beyond to make sure that we're perceived well and that we feel included, because it's biologically written into our DNA. Common conditions. Okay, I'm going to give you this information, and I'm asking you to use it to get curious and to not diagnose yourself or anyone else. This information is not permission to diagnose your spouse or your child or your parent. It is just information. In fact, in my practice, I don't diagnose people. I don't take insurance because I don't like diagnosing people, because I think it puts labels on people and puts them in boxes. And I get that this gives us common language and also can give us a framework for healing, a path to take, if you will. So we're going to start with depression. I'm going to read some symptoms to you. And I'm going to save trauma for last because it's the most complex. So depression. Some things people might experience would be persistent feeling of sadness, emptiness that lasts for most of the day, for at least 2 weeks, loss of interest in things you once enjoyed, It could come with a sudden change in appetite, a sudden weight gain, weight loss, physical aches and pains, thoughts of suicide, escape fantasies. I just want to turn my car west and keep driving and not go back home. That's what I call an escape fantasy. Thoughts of hurting oneself or other people, difficulty concentrating, and feelings of worthlessness. Anxiety is the most common experience in the United States. Shocker. The physical experience that many people have is heart palpitations, dizziness, headaches, difficulty concentrating, feeling tense, irritable. Avoiding places and situations that create more anxiety can be something that occurs, checking things, difficulty keeping up with taking care of yourself or other people who are dependent on you, difficulty sleeping, staying asleep, and GI issues can come with that. Bipolar. There are manic episodes and there are depressive episodes and there are mixed episodes. Here's one thing that drives me insane is the just throwing out of these terms, right? We have all these buzzwords that we really like to use. And I'm being gaslit, or, it was so traumatic. It's so bipolar. He's so bipolar. I think it kind of does a disservice to individuals who legitimately do carry these diagnoses. So what bipolar actually is, it's not weather that goes from really cold to really hot. It's actually a biological, neurobiological condition that people suffer from. And it doesn't always look like high, high, low, low. In fact, the most dangerous form of bipolar, there's two forms, is bipolar 2, in which it's what we call a hypomanic episode. So maybe you aren't going and buying a private jet. Maybe you're going to Target and spending $5,000. So it's like a little hiccup, right, of the nervous system. And what's most scary about that is an SSRI like Zoloft is something you can take that would actually make that episode worse. Bipolar is also triggered by sleep deprivation, which is why we see it presenting most commonly in college students and in the perinatal season because of sleep deprivation. So these hypomanic episodes are marked by energy, just like no need for sleep. I'm constantly going, which turns out is really, really beneficial in 2025 in the US to be able to work and work and work and not need sleep is celebrated. But so that's where the hypomanic can actually be adaptive and helpful. Racing thoughts, speaking really quickly, or what we call pressured speech, having grandiose thoughts or delusions. You'll go from that to depressive episodes. So bipolar 2, what I was talking about, presents as depression, which is why many prescribers will give SSRIs and then it will get worse because it presents as depression. Feeling down, feeling slowed down, having trouble falling asleep, feeling hopeless, having little energy. And then a mixed episode would be having both of those things at the same time. Eating disorders, we have anorexia and we have bulimia. Anorexia is not eating, not consuming food. Bulimia is purging food. There can be all sorts of symptoms of that with anorexia. There can be an absence of a menstrual cycle for women. One thing we don't talk about enough that is important to consider is that this isn't just a diagnosis that applies to women. There are many men who struggle with eating disorders. It can also manifest as over-exercising. It's grounded in body dysmorphia. So essentially, individuals will look into the mirror and what they see is very different than what most other people see when looking at them. Substance use disorder, impaired control over substance use. We saw a spike in this during COVID, unsurprisingly. And high functioning, reliance on substances is more widespread than we like to think. It can be marked by risky use of these beverages or whatever the substance is through going and driving or caretaking for other people while under the influence of them. It's really marked by tolerance, so an increase in tolerance. And for individuals who go without the substance, some withdrawal impacts. Okay, let's talk about trauma real quick, and then we will move right along. But at trauma, this is another buzzword. We're going to talk about big T trauma, little t trauma, and CPTSD. I could talk about these subjects for a week straight and not stop because there's so much data surrounding trauma. What trauma is when our nervous system recognizes that there is a threat, too big, too fast, and we are not built to move through that without going into fight or flight. A big T trauma is a significant event. So we're talking about an accident, a moment like exposure to war. Okay? These are big events. Small T trauma is an ongoing experience that elicits that same nervous system response, like bullying, ongoing criticism, ongoing gaslighting. Those are little T traumas, and they both impact the nervous system. One thing, let me tell you about CPTSD before I get into that. Chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, or complex. This is what we talk about when it's developmental. So when I'm working with someone who is a prisoner of war, a hostage situation, who was held for an extended period of time, or when I'm working with someone who experienced trauma, so emotional or physical abuse in an ongoing manner during developmental years. As you can imagine, that's going to impact the attachment system, which is our primal part of our body that learns who we can trust and ultimately says you can't trust that person you're supposed to be able to trust, and so rewires our whole brain to learn how to exist in the midst of not being able to rely on our trusted caretaker, okay? The brain wires around perception, not reality. And what I mean by that is when I'm working with a mom who has birth trauma, let's use that example, I don't need the medical records to treat her. I don't need to know what happened in the operation room. I need to know what she remembers because her nervous system, her fight or flight neurons, and the way her brain formed is based out of her experience. It is not based on those records. If she perceived that she was about to die, her nervous system wired around that. Another really important piece of information for you to know is that when we take in memories in the midst of a traumatic event, our memory scatters. We store it in a fragmented state. So smell is over here, taste is over here, vision's over here. We don't have it all integrated. And so if you've ever, 4th of July, the fireworks are going off and a veteran hits the ground, right? That's a classic example. The amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for fight or flight, doesn't tell time. So that part of our brain is so primal, its only job is to send us into survival mode. And it's not going to slow down to say, oh, wait, it is 9:28 on this date. It's not going to do that. It's just going to say, hit the ground, fight, flee, fawn, or freeze. And that's its job. And so when that person hears that the firework go off, they aren't going to encode what time or day it is because their body, God built them so brilliantly to survive that they're going to hit the ground and they're going to stay safe. Another example is if I have someone I'm working with who was repeatedly sexually assaulted, and there was lavender in the room every time this happened. And then 20 years later, she goes on a girls' trip and they go to a spa and it smells like lavender. And she all of a sudden feels agitated and she can't figure out why. All the women are having a great time. It's Zen. She's not having a Zen time. She's panicking. She might not realize that that's because it's connected subconsciously to this event. Okay, so trauma is complex, that particular trauma. It stores differently for different people. It's based in perception, not reality. Some common symptoms you would see in survivors of traumatic events would be avoiding stimuli that reminds them of those events. It would be hypervigilance. It would be rage. With that CPTSD, we're going to see a lot of attachment struggles. So relationship impairment. We're going to see a lot of difficulty connecting with people, having intense and unstable kind of connections that lead to abuse or toxicity. Okay, so that's my bit on trauma. We're going to talk about signs of poor mental health. Here's some of the emotional signs, behavioral signs, physical signs. You know, it's really easy to look at these lists and think about your spouse or your child or your parent. I would invite you to think about you, just to get curious. One thing I like to point out is that mental health exists on a continuum. So we like to think that someone either has depression or doesn't, like a light switch. I find it to be more of a dimmer, where there's like a continuum. We talk a lot now, and you probably have heard of the spectrum, the autism spectrum. There's some therapists out there that think soon we'll have an ADHD spectrum. A lot of these things are actually going to be starting to present as spectrums, because the truth of the matter is it's just not that black and white. It's not that binary. Some people have really debilitating symptoms of anxiety, and some people are really high functioning and okay to operate with low doses of therapy or medicine. I want to equip you with something I teach a lot of my clients. And I did not create this. Someone much smarter than me created this. But it's called the window of tolerance. And essentially, it's a framework for understanding the nervous system. Has anyone here heard of the window of tolerance? No. Okay. So when we are within that window of tolerance, that's our parasympathetic nervous system. We have blood flow all over, oxygen to all parts of the brain. We're able to solve puzzles and have really great conversation. We're able to parent well. We're able to connect deeply with others. When we are triggered, so when our amygdala says threat, 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 we either fly above our window of tolerance or below our window of tolerance. When we are above our window of tolerance, that's what we call hyperarousal. And this is fight or flight. This is where anxiety lives. This is where rage lives. In 2025, it might look like slamming a door, yelling at your partner, getting in the minivan, slamming the door, and heading west, right? This is your standard fight or flee response. Okay? And when we fly up here, our blood flows from our brain, all the oxygen, to our limbs to help us fight or flee. This is a very primal system. This is the way the Lord designed us to survive. And so because of that, we don't have oxygen and all of the things we need to the parts of our brain that would help us have a really thoughtful solution to a problem or a really well-articulated response to an argument. And that's because we are trying, primally, to fight the bear or run from the tiger. That's not a time for you to deeply connect with someone or solve a problem. Other people will fly below, or sometimes you might fly below that window of tolerance, and this is what we call hypoarousal. And this is where depression kind of camps out. This is where what we call dissociation camps out, where people just disconnect from their bodies. They might look into space. This could be where a good Netflix binge comes in, right? It's just a disconnection from reality. We call it the freeze response. Another term you might hear is the fawn response, which is a socially appropriate freeze. It's like muscle memory. So when I hear about that, it's like I'm working with a person who was assaulted, and after the ordeal, she bats her eyelashes and says, "Thank you, it was a great time," and leaves. That's a fawning response. That's because she's trying to stay socially safe. Okay. This window of tolerance is different widths for different people. Okay, some people have a really wide window of tolerance. Those are the individuals who it takes a lot to ruffle their feathers. Do you know anyone like that? Like they can handle a lot and aren't going to get agitated, at least not outwardly. And then there are some people with a very small window of tolerance where it does not take a whole lot to send them off the handles. Okay, the width of this window changes throughout time, based on self-care, environmental factors, socioeconomic status, hormones, sleep deprivation. All of these things can impact how big or small your window is. When people come to me for therapy, I tell them they are hiring me to help them widen their window of tolerance. okay? Spiritual practices, leaning into prayer, leaning into worship, all of that. We have data, we have actual brain scans that show that that enhances the window of tolerance, okay? All right. So I'm giving you that information because I find it to be really helpful with caring for yourself. I also find it to be so helpful when I'm working with couples to help them be able to name what's going on. Hey, I'm like way out of my window of tolerance. I just can't right now. Give me 10. Okay. So that's language to use. In the therapy world, we like to say name to tame, kind of helps us name it, which kind of diffuses the intensity of an emotion. But here's some other ways to care for yourself. Prayer, meditation, journaling is a great practice. There's some research that shows actually writing in a journal is different than typing. So keep that in mind. It's more beneficial to write. Physical health, exercise, healthy eating. 96% of serotonin is made in the gut. When I talk about the window of tolerance and I talk about the way that our blood flows to our limbs, that gets trapped there if we don't do something about it to tell our brain we fought the bear. We ran from the tiger and now we're okay. So to reset that nervous system, we need deep muscle stimulation. We need something that will tell our brain we did the thing, you're okay now, which is why exercise can be so, so beneficial. As well as an anti-inflammatory diet. There's just a lot of science saying that the inflammation can contribute to symptoms of anxiety and depression. And seeking help, recognizing when it's time to see a therapist such as myself or a doctor to consult about issues that you might be experiencing. Ways to care for others, listening and being empathetic, encouraging and normalizing access to a therapist, having some names of people you trust that someone can reach out to. Practical assistance. I will have people that I'm working with who are in crisis or who are experiencing a lot of anxiety write down their top 5 stressors in order of what's causing most stress to what's causing the least stress. And then I have their family or their support system help tackle those things from top to bottom. Because people who are in fight or flight cannot think critically, they actually don't have the capacity to tell you what they need. It can be helpful to just say, hey, I'm coming by, I'm going to do a load of laundry and bring you a meal. Right? Just kind of telling them, unless that's obviously an invasion, then don't do that. That would be weird. Praying together, we're going to get to some delicacies around that here in a second, and creating a supportive environment. Okay, I'm about to talk about something, and I'm going to offend some of you, and I find it to be helpful to put that on the front end. And I'm going to invite you to be curious, because when I first read about this, I felt incredibly offended. Because we all do this. And it is spiritual bypassing. When I told you about my brother or my friend that came over and helped me when I was in crisis, and he actually moved in with us, a saint, helped get up in the middle of the night with the baby. And I noticed one day, I was walking downstairs and we have this landing where I had, some decoration, like a vase or something. But rocks started appearing that said different words like hope, faith. They just started appearing. I don't know where they came from. I later found out he was putting some there. But those rocks became like a little subtle reminder every time I went downstairs to get my pump or do whatever I'm doing. I can have hope. I can have hope. There was no one in my face trying to pray for me, offer me scripture. Nobody was trying to cast out a demon from me. Nobody was telling me that there was darkness in my environment. There were just these rocks. I later wrote like a whole blog on friends that leave rocks, because that was the most powerful intervention for me during that dark time. That eventually it was these little places of light that brought me to a place of healing, ultimately, and connection with others. Spiritual bypassing, I'm going to say something really, really powerful and really, really strong, but I believe it cheapens the work of the cross. I really do. I think that by using it, we are shutting down parts of people from bringing their full selves into the presence of God. Because it shames parts. It can shame parts of people by telling them that something's wrong with them, because we're meaning-making machines, right? It's not like, oh, you're giving me prayer because you love me. There can be a quick meaning that we generate that says, they're praying for me because I'm broken, something bad, I'm bad, something's wrong with me. Okay? And the truth of it, there's partial truth in that. We're all broken, we all need Jesus, there is something wrong with us. The use of spiritual beliefs or practices is a way to avoid dealing with difficult emotions, psychological wounds, or unresolved personal issues. Rather than confronting painful experiences, challenges, or aspects of the self, individuals engage in spiritual practices or ideas to deny, suppress, or escape from emotional pain, trauma, and psychological conflict. In short, spiritual bypassing involves using spirituality as a coping mechanism to avoid engaging deeper, often uncomfortable work. And I see this all of the time. I'm going to give you 6 things that might be a sign that you're spiritual bypassing someone or that you have been spiritually bypassed. Avoiding emotional pain. So, avoiding emotional pain. People practicing spiritual bypassing, they'll often use concepts like forgiveness, detachment, or being in the present moment to avoid confronting difficult emotions like grief and anger, or shame, or sadness. And instead of processing these emotions, they might try to bypass them or suppress them. Overemphasis on positive thinking. Maybe you've heard the term toxic positivity. It's the inability to hold that and. It's the, oh, just be grateful you have a healthy kiddo. Or, oh, just be grateful that, they know Jesus and now they're in heaven. It's squashing out the fact that, yeah, I am grateful and I'm devastated. I'm living in despair. It's the and. Excessive detachment. So it may involve distancing oneself from the material world or relationships, often with the justification that you're seeking higher consciousness. It's like monastic living. I'm going to go on a silent retreat and just distance myself through the guise of being really spiritual, but really you're just trying to escape your own emotional pain. Denial of the shadow self. So the shadow self in psychology refers to parts of us that we suppress or that we might not be fully aware of because of, we feel shame about them or how they present in public. So we learn to just stuff them and leave them over here. And spiritual bypassing can involve ignoring those parts, shaming those parts, continuing to leave them over here and not bringing them into our small group, our church, our worship settings. And it can prevent us from being fully integrated as individuals. Using spirituality to control others, which is a really sad thing, but it happens a lot. The church is like a magnet for narcissistic behaviors. There's a book, a really good one out there about church and narcissism. But using spirituality to control others can look like spirituality justify superiority or control over others, claiming that they're more enlightened or spiritually advanced. And it can manifest in hierarchical, kind of elitist belief systems within the church. And then over-identification with spiritual experiences. This can kind of be individuals who develop almost an addiction to those mountaintop experiences. So like the conference hoppers, individuals that enjoy like the big emotional kind of worship settings, and they jump from that to that to that to that, and have difficulty sitting with the stillness and maybe even the mundane of everyday life as a believer. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too painful. Here are next steps, which I like to supply. And then I'll pause and let you guys ask any questions if you have any. What to stop? Spiritual bypassing, suppressing or ignoring, existing on autopilot. I'm so excited for you guys in this group you're starting on EHS. I think that could be a great place to dig in your heels and get to know a little bit more about yourself, about your family or other people in your community. So I'd highly recommend engaging that. Model vulnerability, model the ability to be a follower of Jesus and messy. We need more of that. To be in the midst of process, right? It's glory to glory. Sanctification's like an ongoing thing. So being able to sit with that and ask others how they're doing. Seek support. I gave Regan some resources. I don't know how they're giving those to you guys, but if this brought something up for you and you want to talk or you're looking for a provider in the area, he has some resources for you all, and I'm obviously a resource as well. You're welcome to email me if you're on Instagram and you're that type of person. Pearl in Process is my handle. You can find me on there as well. These are things you can continue. You're already doing them. The fact that you're here shows that you're wanting to learn and grow. Does anyone, it is 9:45. My understanding is that at 50 is when we transition. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. It's a book by Peter Scazzaro, and they're doing a small group on that book. And if you can't go to the small group, just get the book. This is really good. Any other questions?
Can you just go a little bit further with the bypassing?
Yeah.
Can you say that in a different way?
Yes. Spiritual bypassing is when we utilize or weaponize, in some regard, prayer, spiritual disciplines as an effort to escape deep, difficult emotions and holding tension rather than using the and. So it's just go pray more, just be grateful, I'm just going to go to this conference and then Jesus will touch me. I won't have to visit these hard, difficult things. I'm trying to think of times that I've personally experienced spiritual bypassing. I mean, I had a client recently, a couple, they aren't working with me right now, but when I was working with them at the time, it was an abusive relationship. And she said, I don't need therapy right now. I just need to focus on prayer. I just need to go to church more. I need to pray. And that's what he needs to do. He needs to do that. True, right? There are pieces of that are true. And it was an actively abusive relationship. They needed some additional support. So kind of goes back to that or rather than and. Did that answer it? And the book, I believe Scazzaro's book goes into spiritual bypassing as well. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you go back to the slide that I think was right before the no tolerance?
Here we are. Mm-hmm. Signs of poor mental health. Yeah. I think, when I talk to groups of people who are looking to support their family members, or I will talk a lot to teachers or babysitter groups of people who are supporting and caretaking. I remind them, you don't know how someone is doing. You don't know if someone's having suicidal thoughts unless you directly ask them. You cannot. That is not something you can assume, because people assume that often. What can be really scary is if someone says, sorry, I'm going on a tangent and all you wanted to see was the screen, I realize. But if someone says, yes, I am having thoughts of hurting myself, your next question would be, do you have a plan? After that question, it would be, do you have means to follow through with your plan? And despite if their answer is yes or no, you say, okay, together, we're going to go to the emergency department and they're going to help connect us with someone, because that is considered an emergency. So those would be the steps you take if someone were to ever say, yes. I find we talk about that a lot. We say, make sure you're asking people, but we don't really give, okay, then what do we do? And so then when you hear, yeah, I am, it can leave people with a deer in the headlights, kind of, what do I do? So any other questions before we dismiss and you guys go learn more? Thanks for joining me.